I learned very quickly that ordinary days are liars. One minute you're unloading the dishwasher and humming some terrible pop song because it's easier than thinking. The next minute your life is rearranged by a single crack of a tree limb. My name is Nadine Smith. I am a wife, a mother to 2 small humans, Emma, 6, and Jonah, 4. And for the last 12 years, the person who keeps our little house from turning into a wildlife refuge. William, my husband, is the kind of man who gives away the good coffee and keeps the spare blanket for someone who looks colder than he does. He's charitable in a way that makes people feel both lucky and slightly guilty. The day it happened, Will was clearing a fallen ash from the lane. It had been a wet spring, and the road to our house gets slippery. We'd been meaning to call a crew, but Will always said he'd handle it. He called me from the edge of the woods. "Just a sec, Nadine. I'll have it off the road." And then silence, and then the sound of him swearing like a sailor I didn't know existed. I drove down to find him with half the trunk still leaning where it fell and a bleeding leg that turned sickly in the light. We ended up at the ER. Will, who hates hospitals, who made a volunteer appointment at the shelter the next week before he was discharged, lay there with a splint and a face that looked like someone had tried to draw him with a blunt pencil. The orthopedist said he'd torn something important, ligament, maybe tendon. The words blurred because of the way my hands were shaking. He needed rest, immobilization, and pain control. Dr. Franks, who introduced himself with a clipped, efficient manner and a name tag that read Franklin J. Franks, MD, prescribed tramadol, 100 milligrams twice a day. He told us the dose would help him sleep, keep the pain from wrecking his nights, and allow the injury to settle. Will took pain well for the first day. He slept a lot, which I expected. He couldn't drive. We both agreed he shouldn't operate the lawnmower or anything that involved velocity and responsibility. Emma made a get-well card with macaroni glued on in a hopeful constellation. Jonah insisted on sleeping in our bed for a week because Daddy needs hugs. I juggled ibuprofen schedules, school drop-offs, dinner, the mountain of laundry that never forgives, and a cautious pride that I could do this. Because you do it. You put your life on secondment while the person who hates being slow heals. What I did not know then, sitting on the edge of Will's bed while he slept and trying to read a book but not getting past the first sentence, was how quickly a medication could change the landscape of a person. The prescription felt like a temporary clinical thing. 2 pills twice a day, an extra line on the pharmacy receipt. It felt manageable. It felt, in the dim light of that night, like the smallest possible disruption to the most ordinary life. That's the setup. The stakes were simple and gigantic at the same time. If Will recovered normally, we'd be back to the kind of life that smells faintly of coffee and sawdust. If something went wrong, if medication turned him into someone I no longer recognized, if his generosity became a brittle, dangerous thing, then the people who'd sleep under my roof would change, and I'd have to decide what to do with the pieces. The first time he said something weird, I thought it was the medicine still wearing off, like when you wake from a nap and your brain hasn't filed the right nouns yet. He was sitting at the kitchen table, one sock on, staring at the cereal like it had grown a second personality. "What are you looking at?" I asked, sliding a mug toward him. He looked up with that half-lidded, faraway look and said, clear as day, "Moonlight speaks in spoons." I smiled the way you smile at a toddler trying to be poetic, cute, disarming, temporary. He laughed at his own comment and reached for the sugar, and for a moment it was just one of those odd, private things between us. Then the nonsense got stranger. Words that didn't belong in a sentence stacked together like broken beads. "Tuesday carpets the pigeon," he said while putting on his coat. Once he called me a door waiting to be famous. He laughed after most of these lines, a high, delighted sound that didn't match the look in his eyes. A few days later, he sat on the living room floor with Jonah on his lap, and while Jonah colored, Will looked at me with an expression that was all curiosity and no recognition and said, "You are not the mother." Then, as if he'd just told the punchline to a joke only he understood, collapsed into this bubbling, helpless laughter. For a second, I felt a physical shift in the room, like the air had lost track of what it was supposed to be doing. Emma stopped coloring and looked between us. Will wiped his eyes, smiled, and in a voice that tried on normalcy like clothing he'd forgotten in a closet, said, "What? I'm kidding." But he wasn't kidding. The delusions didn't come in neat clusters. They arrived as interruptions. During dinner, in the car when he dozed, while he was watching the news and murmured that the anchors were cooking the weather with spoons. Once, he started telling me a story about how the maple tree in our yard was actually a ladder for angels, and then announced that he wanted to climb it to see if the neighbors were having a better Saturday. It felt less scary at first than it felt wrong. Will is the kind of man who owns 1,000 mismatched socks because he can't bear to throw one away. Seeing him say things that didn't fit was like watching someone knit a sweater with a spoon. I laughed sometimes because laughter felt safer than fear. And when I laughed, he laughed louder, as if the medication had made him addicted to amusement. But the laughter started to thin out at the edges. He began to forget small, critical things. He mixed up dinner times, left the blender running, and once tried to pour orange juice into the dog's bowl. More upsetting were the moments when he drifted toward aggression with things that weren't aggressive before. He kept trying to fix the lawnmower even though I told him not to. He insisted he could help Jonah with a project that involved a hammer. He made plans, strange plans, like arranging the furniture at 2 a.m. because the chairs wanted to see their shadows. I began keeping a notebook by the bed. Date, time, what he said. It felt unbearably maternal and oddly like evidence, a ledger of unmoored sentences. After the "you are not the mother" incident, I started to worry that he might accidentally hurt someone or himself. The thought of him posting some of the nonsense online or sending it to his elderly mother, who took everything he said at face value, made my stomach flip. Will's phone buzzed with business emails and messages from people he mentored. His laptop was the repository of all our household accounts. If he tried to email his boss about the Angels ladder or call his mother to tell her the neighbor was rehearsing with spoons, the fallout could be small embarrassment or huge nightmares. So I changed the passwords. It felt, for a second, both logical and monstrous. I switched to a phrase that even I struggled to remember, an absurd string of words and numbers, and typed them into his phone, his work laptop, the tablet Emma used for educational games. I moved the physical keys in the house. I told myself this was triage, not control. It was not a choice I would have made if the Will I love had been in his skin. He noticed. He frowned, asked who moved the keys in that confused, precise tone. I said, I did. You can't drive right now. He accepted it for a while, then grew suspicious. Quiet, pressing questions at odd hours about whether I was keeping things from him. Once he asked me, deadpan, "Are you the key?" and then laughed like a man who had told himself a secret. The worst thing was the way the kids looked at him. Jonah began to ask if Daddy was sick, broken. Emma, with the blunt honesty of 6 years, told me one night over cereal that Daddy's brain is making new words. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She was trying to describe the new map of our household. Then came the night he tried to leave. It was well after midnight. The house hummed in that deep, low way it does when it's asleep, except for the refrigerator and crickets. Will got up from bed and padded toward the door, barefoot and muttering something about the highway needing to see my socks. Jonah stirred and then turned over. The house felt like a thing that could tilt. I caught him in the hallway, with one hand on the doorknob. The light from the porch washed his face with a blue that made the lines under his eyes look like a topography map. He smelled faintly of antiseptic and pills and the oversweet Doritos he'd been snacking on that afternoon. "I'm going out," he said simply. "You're not," I said. My voice was calmer than my insides were. Calm is a practical thing. It's not how you feel, it's what you need to do. He blinked at me like I'd interrupted a thought midstream. He tried to grin. The grin didn't reach his eyes. "Why not?" "Because you can't drive," I said. "You barely walked past the tree without tripping up. You aren't safe." Will's hand went to his pocket. I saw it, a small, predictable motion. He was going for the car keys. I stepped forward and took his wrist. He smelled of the kind of sweating you do when your body thinks it's on stage. There was a sliver of something threatening behind his laughter. Will, Less mirth, more a brittle excitement. He pulled, and for a second it was me against the bandage on his leg, me against the way the medication made him disregard the physical world. I held his hand until he stopped tugging. He laughed, soft, unhinged. "You always play the lock," he said, as if this was some improvised skit. I swallowed the urge to shout. I took the keys from his pocket with both hands like retrieving a live wire. He tried to grab them back, and I tightened my hold until his fingers loosened. His face changed, not angry exactly, but lost, as if someone had moved the roof 3 inches to the left and asked him to keep living. I walked him back to bed, sat on the edge, and waited for him to fall asleep. He lay there murmuring about spoons and ladders and whether the moon preferred coffee. I thumbed the notebook under the lamp and wrote the time at the bottom of the page like engraving a small, stubborn fact into something indelible. When the kids woke up, the house smelled like stale coffee and fear. I felt like a person who had woken up in a house she didn't build. I called in to work, made a batch of pancakes, and texted Dr. Franks with a polite, tight message asking if it was normal for Will to be having hallucinations. I told myself I was only being a worried wife, a rational adult reaching out for a professional opinion. I didn't say, not yet, that my husband had tried to steal the car. That night, lying awake after the kids were finally asleep, I watched Will breathe and counted nothing and everything. I tried to be pragmatic, kept the front door locked, moved the car keys to a high, stupid place, Googled symptoms until my brain felt like a syrup, and tried to prepare for the moment when I'd have to pick a way to protect the children and the man I loved from a pill that seemed to be rewriting him. I was furious in a bright, stinging way that wakes the teeth. Fury makes you practical. It made me plan. It made me keep the passwords changed. It made me wonder whether a person who prescribes a dosage this big without checking could sleep like a human. When Will smiled at me with the kind of innocence that's not innocence at all, just the look of someone who doesn't realize how dangerous they've become, I felt the kind of grief that double binds as anger. The house was quieter than I wanted. The morning light came and hit the spot on the floor where Jonah had dropped a crayon. I folded it into the story I was telling myself. This is temporary. This is medication. This is accidental. But the sentences we make in our heads can be polite lies. And I was beginning to suspect there would be a reckoning bigger than changing passwords and hiding keys. I remember the day we signed the papers like it was a municipal holiday. Gray, bureaucratic, and oddly triumphant. The lawyer's office smelled of cheap coffee and leather chairs that had been softened by 100 nervous elbows. Dr. Franks showed up in a button-down that tried to look apologetic without admitting anything. His eyes darted like someone who keeps a lot of small, private facts in a pocket and doesn't want them spilled. He said the usual lines, "I regret the outcome," "I stand by my clinical judgment," and a version of "I'm sorry you felt harmed." His voice was the clinical register of a man who believed words could be neat boxes, even when people are messy. We didn't go to trial. Trials are loud and public and messy in a way I wanted to avoid, mostly for my kids' sake. Instead, the hospital's risk manager and Dr. Frank's lawyer offered a settlement, $10,000 in exchange for dropping the suit and a confidentiality clause. The confidentiality part made Will twitch. He hates secrets. I hated the idea too. Secrecy felt like a bandage over a wound that needed air. The lawyer, who'd clearly done this dance before, explained that confidentiality was standard. No press, no lawsuit headlines, no sudden investigations dragging us through a machine that eats years. We could refuse, but she made the arithmetic clear. Litigation could take months, eat into savings, and we'd get nothing guaranteed at the end. We took the money. The check felt heavier than $10,000 should. It wasn't just money. It was a small, hard consequence. It was, as far as the legal world would allow, the only immediate acknowledgement that someone with power had been careless. Will and I sat in the car afterward and looked at the check like it was a fossil of the ordeal we'd lived through. He squeezed my hand, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes were steady, sober, like a person who'd remembered where he lived. I could have spent it fixing the broken stove or on new tires for the minivan. We could have put it toward the mounting medical bills and the babysitting I'd needed when I sat in depositions. Practical, safe choices. I almost made them. But practicality is a dull salve, and I'd learned my new favorite thing. Practical doesn't always teach better behavior. Instead, I wrote a letter. It was a short, surgical thing, 3 paragraphs, crisp and to the point. The first described what had happened, what the medication had done to my husband, the late-night escape attempt, the ruined nights full of spoon ladders and nonsense. I did not embellish. The second paragraph explained what the settlement meant to us, and that we would accept it not as a bribe, but as an opportunity to make sure the same thing didn't happen to somebody else. The third asked, politely, for a condition. I told them I wanted the money used to create a patient education fund in the clinic waiting room. Not some invisible donation into the hospital's black hole. I wanted something public, practical, and unavoidable. Pamphlets about opioid and analgesic side effects. A laminated sheet with contraindications clearly listed. A little board where doctors would sign their names after attending an annual pain management refresher course, mandatory short certificates. And finally, a small plaque acknowledging the gift and why it existed. I expected some resistance. Instead, the attorney passed my letter along, and the clinic administrator called the next morning and, after a pause that felt like someone counting possible liabilities, agreed. It's a generous way to channel this, she said, with all the institutional neutrality of a person who's had to explain things to committees. Dr. Franks didn't have a legal leg to stand on if he opposed a donation meant for education. He could refuse on principle, he could not easily refuse on optics. When the materials arrived, they were more modest than the bile in my chest wanted to be. The pamphlets were tasteful, single-sheet affairs. What your pain medication might do, and how to talk to your doctor about side effects, printed in calm colors and headed with the clinic's logo. The little board of signed doctors was the thing that made my stomach do a small, vindicated flip. The plaque, though, is what I spent the most time writing. It read, "This patient safety fund was established by Nadine and William Smith following an adverse reaction resulting from a prescribed analgesic. May this resource help patients and clinicians make safer, more informed decisions." Beneath the text was, in smaller letters, donated in Will's name. I insisted on the wording. It was factual, and it could not be called libelous because it was true. Our reaction had happened. The check had been written. I wanted the plaque to hang where people waited, under the wall clock, near the faded magazine rack, right at eye level for anyone with a new prescription and a head full of trust. The unveiling was an odd sort of small-town opera. I enrolled Will, who was hesitant until he saw the kids' faces. Emma clutched a paper flower she'd folded at school. Jonah nodded like someone rehearsed in optimism. The clinic made tea and brought out little cookies that smelled like the kind of hospitality that hopes to smooth over discomfort. Dr. Franks stood behind the podium with a face that had gone the color of someone learning to say regret publicly. I gave a short, steady speech, no Shakespeare, just plain sentences, and told our story. I did not name call. I did not demand penance. I said, we were hurt. We asked for accountability. We accepted this settlement in the name of preventing the same harm from happening again. Afterwards, people came up to us. An elderly man clapped my shoulder and said he'd had night terrors on a medication once and never told his doctor. A woman in scrubs said she'd been meaning to talk to patients about side effects, but felt like she never had the tools. The clinic manager thanked us. Dr. Franks, caught between the small charge of conscience and the bigger one of reputation, signed the board that said he had completed the clinic's new online module on safe prescribing. It was, by design, minor public humiliation and major public good. He had to look at the plaque every time he walked through that lobby. He had to watch patients read it. He could not pretend nothing had happened. There is a quiet kind of revenge in making amends, cough up a little daylight. The money didn't bankrupt Dr. Franks. He still saw patients. He still wore the same neutral blouses and used the same clipped phrases. But something in the clinic's architecture had changed. Openness about medication risks was no longer a whisper behind the nurse's station. It became a thing people saw, read, and could use. Will recovered in the steady, imperceptible way injuries heal when no one's watching. The weird sentences faded like a TV show coming to an end. Some episodes left in reruns, but mostly quiet. He relearned where the car keys lived, relearned to read Jonah's drawings without asking whether pigeons had carpets. His laughter returned the honest way of someone who remembers the punchline and also the joke's human limits. As for me, I learned something I didn't want to like but could not unsee. Revenge doesn't have to be the latest, gnarled invention of your worst impulses. It can be a small, carefully aimed practicality that teaches someone a different way to walk through the world. I wanted accountability, not blood. I wanted better pamphlets in waiting rooms and doctors who read continuing education modules, not because they feared lawsuits, but because they feared harming someone sitting across from them. The plaque hangs in that lobby like a quiet, persistent fact. People read it. Nurses point to it when handing out prescriptions. A few weeks after the unveiling, I walked past the clinic and saw Dr. Franks standing by the receptionist's desk, reading through a stack of pamphlets, with a furrow that was no longer the glare of a man hiding from consequence, but the study of someone correcting a mistake. That was enough. It was not pyrotechnic. Nothing exploded. No career collapsed and no one left hungry. Instead, something like prudence settled into a room that had been too casual with pills. Will's laugh returned to its old, cheap coffee timbre. The kids stopped asking if Daddy's brain was making new words. The last image I have from that year is the plaque catching autumn light through the clinic's foyer window, letters sharp against a background that had once been our private hurt and was now, inconveniently for Dr. Franks, something anyone could read. I liked knowing that if he ever tried to forget, the waiting room would not let him. The revenge, such as it was, tasted faintly of triumph and a strong cup of ordinary justice. A small public correction that made the next patient's morning a little safer.